Lord, thank you for your written word, Lord. The things that you've said to us, that you've spoken to us. And today as we dig into Habakkuk, Lord, just speak to us. Amen. We're doing Habakkuk today. I recently heard. We've been going through Micah, and the intent was all along to interweave Habakkuk, and there's some similarities. Only one is from a community standpoint, and a little bit more. We'll get into it. But someone's flying overhead. So Micah, Habakkuk, and you know we were, for those of you that just a peek behind how the sausage is made, I guess the teaching team, we've been praying about this and thinking about it, and I don't know, it was late August and in early September we were feeling like, yeah, this is where we're headed, and it was kind of, I don't know, maybe late September when we got started, but around Labor Day, we were going, yeah, this, and you know how it is when, I don't know if you experience this, but I do all the time, where God says do this, and you go, okay, and you can see like a couple reasons why, and then more become apparent as you're doing it, and there's probably some that are, still in the mind of God, and you're not going to know, but you just know that He told you to do it. So some of those things are that both of these books deal in a really balanced presentation of the character of God. There's this like judgment side, and there's this hope side. And in Micah, we've talked about this a little bit, how those are interweaved, and in the chapters we're going to get to, they're also interweaved. And this judgment and hope, which is God's justice and mercy, right? And both of those sides. And because we really need to approach the Bible to find out, with an attitude of trying to find out what He's like, right? Not see if the Bible will confirm what we think He's like, but try to find out, okay, what's the Bible saying about how God is? What's His character? And both books deal in those messages. Micah at a more community level, and Habakkuk at an individual level, like he's dealing with it himself. This justice and hope side. A couple other reasons that the Lord was showing us was, these books help us how to deal in dealing with injustice in our world, and I use our world in like the personal sense, like your sphere, right? Not the planet, okay, but like your friends, your circle of influence, your work, your world. That world, when we see things that is wrong, when we see injustice, when we see evil, how do we deal with that? How do we live in uncertain times? Right, these guys, especially Habakkuk, were living in very uncertain times, and how do we do that personally? How do we do that corporately at a community level? And then lastly, God's teaching us some things about getting or obtaining and maintaining some emotional health. This was something that I wasn't that I'm passionate about, but I wasn't thinking was going to be in this. This is one of those that God added later. Like once we got started, we're like, yeah, we're going to learn some stuff about this. This is going to be great. And so today will be some more of that. So we're going to do Habakkuk 1. I'm going to slide this over just a tad for now because I have a little slide, because there's a lot of information, and I'm not going to go through it all, but we can at least put it up there. At the end of Habakkuk was active in the final decades of the Jewish nation of Judah before they were taken captive from Babylon, and there's a lot of detail in both 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles about those final years with all the kings and who was attacking who, and it's like they zoomed in on those final decades, and a lot more detail there than in other places. And some of it's really confusing. I put up here the kings, the last few kings of Judah, and that's like a genealogical thing. So like Josiah was the father of those three fellas, and Jehoiakim was the father of Jehoiachin, not confusing at all. And to add to it, the names in parentheses there are the real names of those two guys. But when they got ascended the throne, they used a different name, or they were made to use a different name by the person who put them there. And so, yeah, and some of them, as you see, only reigned for 3 months. A couple of them, So all this stuff is going on, right? And so more or less in 609, 605 to 605, somewhere in that BC, somewhere in that area is where Habakkuk is active. Before that, it's the transition period between the fall of or decline and fall of the Assyrian Empire and rise of the Babylonian Empire. The Assyrians in 612, their capital Nineveh fell, and they retreated to another city and kind of set up base there, and a coalition of Babylonians and a couple other groups, Scythians and I don't know who else, attacked the next place, and they retreated again. So during the early part of his life, of Habakkuk's life, this is what would have been happening, this transition. The Babylonians are on the scene, but they're not the empire yet that they would become. And Josiah, the first king there, was a great reformer. He tore down all the idols. He was like really the last good king that Judah had. He tore down all the idols. He set up the temple again. They found, tucked away in some cubby, a book of the law, and they're like, wow, look at all the stuff we've not been doing. And so they put that back in place, the Passover. They had a Passover that they hadn't celebrated in forever. And so he was a great reformer. His life didn't end so great because he was killed by Pharaoh Necho, I'm not sure how you say that name. And the Pharaoh was going out. He was going out to fight the Babylonians. So he's headed up out of Egypt, and Josiah tries to stop him, and so he says, "Don't get in my way," and he did anyway. And so they fought, and he died in the battle, and then the Egyptians moved on. And actually, I do want to. This is kind of a little bit of a rabbit trail, or not on the main message, but I just can't pass up this opportunity here to read you that interchange between Necho and Josiah when he's going out to fight. And so Josiah he's moving his armies to engage Necho. And Necho says this. He sent messengers to Josiah. He says, What do we have to do with each other, O king of Judah? I'm not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war, and God has ordered me to hurry. Stop for your own sake from interfering with God who is with me, so that he will not destroy you. The Pharaoh is saying this about God, like Yahweh God, right? And you would think, well, maybe he's just using that as like where people say, hey, God's telling me, right? Yeah, right. You're just saying that so that I'll go along with you, because I'm a believer, right? But no, it says, verse 22, this is 2 Chronicles 35. However, Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to make war with him, nor did he listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to make war on the plain of Megiddo. And all I want to say there is that our goal is to be able to recognize God's voice no matter where it's coming from, what the package is, right? Caiaphas, the high priest, in the middle of the kangaroo court against Jesus, spoke with the mouth of God, it says in the Bible. He prophesied about Jesus. He didn't know it, but he was. And so there's something there. There's something here as well that is saying, that's what we're after. God might use the unlikely sources to speak to us, but when we hear His voice, we're able to discern that. And it's presumption to say things like, well, if God wanted me to know that, He'd tell me Himself directly. How many times has that worked out for you guys? Not many for me. He basically says, no, I told Joe to tell you, and you didn't listen. So anyway, so there's that going on. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, defeats Necho, and really that was the end of the Egyptian as an empire, right? They retreated into their own boundaries, and they were never a superpower again. And then later, there was all kinds of, Necho had put this, didn't like Jehoahaz as king, so he put this other guy as king and changed his name, and then Nebuchadnezzar was okay with that for a while, except that guy rebelled, and so then he switched out a king again. I mean, there's all these politics going on, right? So there's a lot of turmoil, and in that time is when Jerusalem ended. You see in 605-ish there is the first kind of time that Babylon takes Judah as like a vassal or subject kingdom, and that's when they cart off a lot of the nobility, like Daniel and his friends. And but then just over the 10 years later, or actually fewer than that, maybe like 8 years later, they had rebelled, and that's when they destroyed the place or took away all the gold. And anyway, just kind of a big decline. So that's kind of the setting. And Habakkuk himself, we don't know a lot about him. We do know the last chapter in the book is a psalm, like a bona fide, like regular psalm that if you had seen it in the book of Psalms, it would have fit right in, right? It has instructions at the beginning, according to Shigionoth or whatever. You guys have seen that in the Psalms, and where it says Selah at the end of a line or stuff like that. And at the end, he says to the choir director, on my stringed instruments, is the last line of the book. So it's like a psalm, which tells us that he was probably a musician. And because he wrote this, and so maybe he was a musician in the temple. There was David had instituted a set of musicians that were supposed to minister in the temple and worship in the temple, and starting in the tent, the tabernacle in David's time. But that tradition was carried forward in some fashion throughout the following centuries. So it's probable that Habakkuk was one of those guys. And the book is just his struggle with this situation. So I have a video that we're going to put on, and it'll kind of show us kind of an overview in quicker and better than I can say it of what the book is like. So.
The book of the prophet Habakkuk. He lived during the final decades of Israel's southern kingdom, and it was a time of injustice and idolatry. He saw the rising threat of Babylon on the horizon, and that was not good news for anybody. But unlike the other prophets, Habakkuk does not accuse Israel. He doesn't even speak on God's behalf to the people. Rather, all of his words are addressed personally to God. And the book tells about Habakkuk's personal struggle, his journey of trying to believe that God is good when there is so much evil and tragedy in the world. And so Habakkuk's words are actually poems of lament, and they're very similar to the laments that you find in the book of Psalms. The poet lodges a complaint and then draws God's attention to suffering or injustice in the world, demanding that God do something. And knowing about this lament form, it's actually the key to understanding the design and message of this short book. Chapters 1 and 2 are framed as a back-and-forth argument between Habakkuk and God, and the prophet lodges two complaints to which God offers two responses. His first complaint is that life in Israel has become horrible. The Torah is neglected, resulting in violence and injustice, and it's all being tolerated by Israel's corrupt leaders. And Habakkuk, he's crying out, asking God to do something, but nothing seems to change. But then all of a sudden, God responds. He says that he's very aware of the corruption of his own people, Israel, and that he's summoning the armies of Babylon to bring down his justice on Israel. And very similar to the message of Micah or Isaiah, God says he will use this terrifying empire to devour Israel because of their injustice and evil. But Habakkuk has a problem with this answer, and so he offers his second complaint. He says Babylon is even worse than Israel. They're more corrupt, they're more violent, they've deified their own military power, they treat humans like animals, gathering them up like fish in a net, he says. They devour nations and people groups in order to build their own empire. And so Habakkuk says, how can you, a holy, good God, use such corrupt nations as your instruments in history? He demands an explanation. In fact, he depicts himself as a watchman on the city walls, waiting for God's response, which eventually comes. God tells Habakkuk to get out some tablets and chisel and write down what he sees and hears. It's a vision about an appointed time in the future, that even though it may seem slow in coming, it will eventually come. In fact, God says that the righteous person will live by their faith in this hope and vision. So what is this divine promise that Habakkuk is supposed to write down? It's that God will bring Babylon down. God says that the violence and oppression of the nations creates this never-ending cycle of revenge, and that God will use this cycle to bring about the rise and fall of nations. And the fact that God might for a time use a corrupt nation like Babylon does not mean that he endorses everything that they do. He holds all nations accountable to his justice, and so Babylon will fall along with any other nation that acts like them. God's promise is then elaborated by a series of 5 woes that describe the kinds of oppression and injustice that's perpetrated by nations like Babylon. The first 2 target unjust economic practices, like how wealthy people will charge ridiculous interest just to keep poor people in debt, and so they build their wealth through crooked means. The third woe is a critique of slave labor, treating humans like animals and threatening them with violence if they don't produce. The fourth woe targets the abuse of alcohol by irresponsible leaders. While people are suffering under their bad leadership, they're partying and wasting their money on sex and booze. And the last woe exposes idolatry, the engine that drives such nations. They have made money and power and national security into their gods, offering these allegiance at all costs. And so people become slaves to their own national empire. Now, the practices described here aren't unique to Babylon, but that's part of the point. Given the human condition, most nations eventually become Babylon. And so this is how God's answer to Habakkuk in this book becomes God's answer to all later generations, to anyone who lives in a world ruled by other Babylons. But it leaves the question hanging. Is God going to let this cycle, the rise and fall of Babylon-like empires, go on forever? And that question is what chapter 3 is about. We're told that this is a prayer of Habakkuk, and it begins by Habakkuk pleading with God to act now in the present like he has in the past in bringing down corrupt nations. And what follows is a very ancient poem. It first describes a powerful, terrifying appearance of God. It's very similar to the opening poems of Micah and Nahum, and similar to the appearance of God at Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. There's cloud and fire and earthquake. When the Creator shows up to confront human evil, everybody will be paying attention. Habakkuk then goes on to describe this future defeat of evil as a future exodus. So just like God came as a warrior and he split the sea in his battle against Pharaoh, Habakkuk says that God will once more bring his judgment down on the head of the evil house. So Pharaoh, like Babylon, has become here an archetype of violent human nations. But at the same time, we're told that when God confronts evil, he will save his people and his anointed one. It's a reference to the king from the line of David. And so in this poem, the Exodus story of the past has become an image of the future Exodus God will perform. He will once again defeat evil and bring down the pharaohs and the Babylons of this world. He'll bring justice to all people and rescue the oppressed and the innocent. And it's this hope that enables Habakkuk to conclude the book with hopeful praise. Even if the world's falling apart with food shortage or drought or war or whatever, he will choose trust and joy in the covenant promises of God. And so Habakkuk, by the end of this book, becomes a shining example of how the righteous live by faith. Habakkuk recognizes just how dark and chaotic the world and our lives can become, and he invites us into a journey of faith, of trusting that God loves this world more than we do, and that he will one day deal with its evil. And that's what the book of Habakkuk is all about.
So yeah, that's what Habakkuk is about in a nutshell. And today we're just going to go through chapter 1. As the video talked about, chapter 1 is mainly his 2 complaints. There's a section in the middle where God is replying to one of his complaints, and then he kind of has another complaint, and then chapter 2 is the rest of God's response, and chapter 3 is Habakkuk's final kind of response to this. So let's go there. I will say a couple things at the beginning, just to reinforce a couple of things that were said there. It's an oracle is the word most often used in English. In Hebrew, it's a word that means like something that's lifted up or a burden. So today we might say, you carry a message. We have that phrase about someone who's carrying a message. It's that kind of idea, right? This burden, this message that they carry, that they have to speak about, and the style of oracles in the Bible is a little different than stuff in other types of writing, and so it's mainly the thing that it's really abrupt. The themes change frequently. Sometimes the subject or object of a sentence kind of changes without much warning or notice, and so if you're not used to that, you can get lost in it. Like, who's talking? What are they talking about? Let me read that again 5 times. And so you have to understand that. And then, as the video mentions, the first chapter in particular is in the form of a lament, which we talked about a few weeks ago, where Micah has a lament also in chapter 1 of Micah. And remember that we talked about in these laments that the objective is to get transformation, to get healing, to hear something from God that will help us out of this situation, right? It's not just complain and throw up all over God and then say, okay, see ya, and leave. But faithful lament or protest is after this. Okay, God, I'm really struggling, but I know you can help me, and so I'm going to complain about it. I'm going to just tell you how I'm feeling. I'm just going to tell you straight up, and see what you say, because I know you're going to say something good. And so that's where Habakkuk is at. And let's read through chapter 1, and we'll make a few comments, and then I'll have some closing thoughts on it. So if I can get myself organized here. All right, chapter 1, verse 1 of Habakkuk. The oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists, and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored, and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. So he's telling him, he's speaking pretty directly to God. He's like, how long are you going to put up with this? I do have one issue with in verse 3, one issue with this is the New American translation, where it says, it caused me to look on wickedness. The me there, from all the commentaries I read, other translations, it's not me like the prophet, it's God. Why the better translation is, why, Lord, why are you looking on wickedness? The NIV says, why do you tolerate wrongdoing? And the English Standard Version says, why do you idly look on wickedness? So this look has this sense of like you're standing by and watching, like you're putting up with it kind of thing. And Habakkuk is like, what's going on, Lord? Why are you doing this? Like, why are you just putting up with this stuff? And I cry out violence, and yet, he says I'm saying, Lord, there's just all this stuff going on, but you're not doing anything. And in that verse, he has verse 3, he has pairs of things, right? Iniquity and wickedness, destruction and violence, strife and contention, three pairs of similar words there. And he goes on to talk in verse 4 about how justice is not happening, right? The law is ignored. No one's standing by it. No one's enforcing the law. And so people are getting away with things. And all the things that shouldn't be happening is what's happening. So in a few verses, he's putting out there a beef that he has with the world he sees around him. And so now we can see in verse 5 that God starts to speak. And he says, "Look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I am doing something in your days. You would not believe it if you were told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans." That's the people group that was in Babylon, right? They're like, Babylonians is like saying Washingtonians or something to Americans, right? That was their capital, but they're called Chaldeans. "For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs." So far, this is shaping up to be a pretty unexpected answer. like Habakkuk is going, okay, what's up with all this bad stuff? And God says, oh yeah, well, let me tell you about something that you would never believe. And he says, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. He says in verse 7, "They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves." That kind of means like they're their own law. They're a law unto themselves, right? They do whatever they want. They enforce whatever they want. Verse 8, he compares them to animals. "Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping down to devour." Verse 9, "All of them come for violence. Their horde of faces move forwards, and they collect captives like sand." These are some bad guys. "They mock at kings, and rulers are laughing, a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap rubble up to capture it." The heaping rubble is, you got a fortress with walls, you're trying to break in. Well, let's build a ramp. Okay, picture building a ramp with a wall that's, 40 or 50 feet high, and how much dirt you would have to pile up to get a ramp that people can walk up on, and maybe horses. Like, we're not talking about just a mountain climbers here. So they're very industrious. They're very warlike. Verse 11, "Then they will sweep through like the wind and pass on." But notice this ending. "But they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God." God's not hiding their guilt or ignoring it. And their strength is their God. The word strength there is just like strength, like muscle strength, like brawn, that kind of strength. And he's saying, look at these people, and this crazy description. And that's what happened later. You remember I was telling you that he defeated this Pharaoh, and that was the city where they defeated him was like up north of Israel, a good ways. And the Egyptian army retreated, a lot of them, and they chased him for like 150 miles and killed him. Like that. That's who he's that hadn't happened yet when Habakkuk is prophesying this. But that's what he's saying when he says, they come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forwards. They collect captives like sand. I mean, this is just some really bad guys. So this is God's really unexpected answer. Like the video said, they're worse. Like Judah's bad, but he's saying, well, these worse people are coming. Way worse. And so here's in verse 12, Habakkuk's reply to this. We can tell he's speaking now because he says, "You, O Lord," right? So now it's switching to Habakkuk speaking. And he doubles down on his question is what he does. He's like, okay, I'm going to ask again, Lord. I still don't get it. So let's read that. Verse 12. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We will not die. So you see his initial shock at what God said. It's like denial. Like, wait, what? You know, like you're an everlasting God and we're your people, and so we'll be okay, right? This initial like disbelief, but in an instant, in one verse, he goes back to belief. He says, "You, O Lord, have appointed them to judge, and you, O Rock, have established them to correct." So in one verse, he's first like shocked and taken aback, and then he's like, "Okay, I believe you. This is what you're doing. I hear you. I know that you've spoken this." But he goes back to his question. He still has this question of like, why are you tolerating wrong? And so that's what verse 13, he goes back to that and he doubles down on this question and he says, your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. That phrase there, you can't see it much in the English, but in the Hebrew, it's like it's a mirror of the phrase in the verse 2 where he says, "Why do you look on evil?" And now he's saying, "You don't look on evil. You're too pure for that. You're too holy for that." So he's really rephrasing his question and doubling down. He says, "I still don't get it, so I'm going to ask again." And I'll point out that God was okay with that. Like he didn't say, "Well, I told you, so shut up." Like, why are you questioning me again? Who are you? Who do you think you are? That was not his reaction, God's reaction. And he was okay with Habakkuk having this honest discussion with Habakkuk. Just an honest discussion. I still don't get it, Lord. So he says, I'll start again, verse 13. Your eyes are too pure to approve of evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? That's the part where he's saying the Babylonians are worse. They're the wicked ones swallowing up us, the more righteous than they. Like, we're not great, but they're worse. How does that work? That the worst guys are going to win. And then he goes into this parable or a metaphor, which I really like how he expands this metaphor. The last 4 verses here of the chapter are this metaphor. Why have you made men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things without a ruler over them? The Chaldeans bring all of them up with a hook, drag them away with their net, and gather them together in their fishing net. There's this metaphor that he's using. Therefore, they rejoice and are glad. Habakkuk has a problem with that. Like, it's not that they're just doing all this stuff. They're happy about it. It's going well for them. Therefore, they rejoice and are glad. Verse 16, therefore they offer a sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their fishing net, because through these things their catch is large and their food is plentiful. I really like how he pulls that metaphor in there. He says these Babylonians, it's like the people of the earth are fish, and they're fishermen, and they're just dragging up all this fish. And then when they're done, they worship their net, because that was the thing that gave them the power, right? That was the thing that gave them the power to abuse, to do what they wanted, to take what they wanted, the power for violence, to capture. Was in the metaphor, it's the net, right? In real life, it's the strength that God, he's heard what God said, because that last verse 11 when God speaks, he says, but they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God. And then here in verse 16, he's saying, yeah, I see what you're saying, that their net is their God. the second part of verse 16, because through these things their catch is large and their food is plentiful. They seem to have it all. Like these guys are doing all the wrong things, but they have it all. It's going great for them. What's up with that? Will they therefore empty their net and continually slay nations without sparing? Like, how long are they going to be able to fish in this ocean, Lord? Like, they're just, where's the end? How long? Why? Those are his questions. And that's the end of the chapter. And in chapter 2, God answers. And I do want to say that, you know, we talked about, when we were talking about laments with Micah, that the key thing when you're in that situation with God is to, if you're there for transformation and healing and help and all that, is that you say whatever you want to God about how you're feeling. Like, lay it out there, be honest. But then there's a time to be quiet and see what he's going to say, because he has something to say that'll help you. And that's what you're after. And when you're honest with him, then he'll give you, he'll be honest with you. Not that he wouldn't be honest, but, you know, he's like saying, okay, I see that you really want my help, that you're not just here to complain, that you're not just, you know. And so, okay. And that's what Habakkuk does in verse 1 of chapter 2. It says, Habakkuk says, okay, I'm going to wait now. I'm going to stand like a watchman on the wall and see what God says to me. So that'll be for another sermon, but I do just want to say that he didn't just like throw all this at God and leave, right? But can you see how intense this is for and personal and honest? Like, it's open. Like, he's not pulling punches about, you know, he's trying to have faith. He's trying to believe. He's saying, okay, I believe you, but I still don't get it. And maybe his problem isn't just that he doesn't get it, but he doesn't like it. Like, he's been in the world for a while, right? I mean, he's an adult. He's not a child. He knows that this is how the world works, but he doesn't like it. And he has a big problem with it. But in all this, he's giving a faithful lament to God. And I'll use the word faithful versus unfaithful lament. You know, I'll phrase it this way: the subtle difference at the beginning is a faithful lament is, okay, God, how could you allow this or that to happen? And an unfaithful lament, kind of just griping, is, well, how could God allow? Right? Or just, you're talking about him in the third person. You're just griping to somebody else. You're just gossiping or venting or whatever. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to discuss like things that you don't understand with other believers. But when it's that attitude of, how could he do that? I'm just sick of it. Well, you know, ask him. He'll probably tell you something. And so there's just I just love this, how open and honest this chapter is, because he got a wallop of an answer, right? Like he got this answer that was not what he was expecting. How many of you asked God for an answer and it wasn't? You got an answer and it wasn't what you were expecting. And maybe later it turned out to be good and you understood it, but at first you're like, I asked you what color is the sky, and you said cheese. Like, I don't understand the answer. Like, what, you know? You can tell I've been there. In Job, there's a verse that captures this in a single verse, which for the length of Job and all the back and forth, and it's awesome that certain things are captured in small sections. They're easy to get and grasp, because Habakkuk has this thing going on where he believes in God, right? He's saying, you're the everlasting one, you're the rock, we're your people, but he's also has questions. And so there's this duality there. And Job, speaking in it's one of his replies to his friends, verse 15 of chapter 13. So chapter 13, verse 15, of Job, Job says this, speaking of God, though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. Isn't that powerful? He says, even if he killed me, I would still trust him. Like, that's how deep it goes. He says, but that's not going to stop me from asking a question. He says, nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. I still have a question. I really trust him. I trust him so much. But I'm still going to ask some questions because I don't. There's things I don't understand, and I just want him to say something that will help me. That's what I want. And Jesus modeled that for us on the cross when his darkest hour on this earth, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? The anguish in that cry. But by the end, right before his death, his last breath, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. He knows what's going on. He's God. He understands it, unlike us most of the time. But he's still being honest and saying, I just feel abandoned. I just feel abandoned. But I'm still going to trust my spirit to you. You're still God. So, in closing, here's what I want to talk about, and it might be a little, I don't know. It's something that people would say, "Oh, that's deep," whatever that means. I could see people saying things about that. I don't think it's hard to understand, but I did write it down so I could say it in a certain way, and I think it's really important. Like when I was preparing, I think this is Pastor Dane that we used to have at Harbor Point used to say, if you've heard nothing else that I've said this morning, hear this, he would say. So that's where we're at. So it's this. In the search for truth, faith and reason are not at odds. Okay? Some people think that faith has no place in the search for truth. Most scientists think that faith has no place in the search for truth. Some people think that reason has no place in the search for truth. Like, you just got to believe. But I don't get it. Doesn't matter. Turn your brain off. Just believe. And others realize that both are required, but they get the order wrong. Okay, so here's the thing. Faith is found at the end of reason, not at the beginning. Faith is found at the end of reason, not at the beginning. It's needed. It's where it comes into play, is at the end. When reason has taken you as far as it can in trying to understand or search for a truth, but you're not there. There's the truth. You're here. There's a gap. You've come as far as you can with your reasoning mind, which God gave you. What's that last step? A step of faith. Or depending on where you're at, a leap of faith or a giant leap. But a lot of times we want to put it first and say, well, faith is, you can't reason through anything. But Habakkuk is doing that. He is reasoning, and he's trying to close that gap, and he's trying to ask God to help him to close that gap. Because he's using his reasoning brain, and some of his reasoning is based on principles about God that he knows, like you're a holy God. Like, you don't tolerate wrong. Right? So it's not just reasoning about, things that you can measure in a lab necessarily, but he's reasoning from principles, and he gets to this gap. And that's where faith is. That's where that leap of faith, that step of faith is. As a parenthetical, I'll say it's still possible to have bad reasoning. Okay, so you need to get the reasoning right. It doesn't mean that every human reasoning or reasoning that you could have is good or solid. But when you're there, then that next leap is faith. And the Bible presents us with all sorts of truths about the nature of God, about the nature of humanity, about the nature of our world. And our journey as followers of Jesus is trying to learn and process and internalize and walk out and live these truths. So we have a goal in mind. Here's this truth. The Bible says it's true. And I'm trying to believe that it's true. And I might get part way by using some reasoning. Well, I could see how, he probably asked him to do this because of that reason. And, he wanted this to happen, and he was trying to keep him safe from that. And, okay. And then I come to a point where, okay, I've thought of all the reasons I can think, but that still doesn't explain it exactly. And that's where faith is. And remember that faith comes from God too, right? Ephesians 2 says that by grace we have been saved through faith, and that is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And then the fruit of the Spirit, faithfulness, is in there. So it's something you get at the beginning, and it's something you grows in you during. So it comes from God. So how about we ask God when we're in that step of faith that we need? Like, a lot of times I think we try to close that gap with reasoning, or just, I'm just gonna believe. Is it working? How about we just say, Lord, give me some faith here. Tell me something that will help me close this gap. I just need to hear your word, your voice. Say something to me that will help me close this gap. Because I want to believe. I'm just trying to get there. That is honest, healthy dialogue with God, and it's okay. Like, you don't have to question your salvation if you have some doubt like that, and you're like, I know that it's true in the Bible that it says it, but I want to know that it's true in here, not just up here. And that's what Habakkuk's doing. He's read the Bible, the Torah. He's read the writings. He knows God is a holy God, and he doesn't tolerate wrong. But he's seeing stuff that he doesn't understand and he doesn't like. So ask for faith. And the point of resolving all these issues is not to silence questions. Like, God is not trying to get you to shut up. Like, I'm just tired of these questions. He's not exasperated by genuine, honest questions. He's not trying to say, look, you just need to get some faith. The point isn't to silence all questions, but the point is to give you something that will, and you might have to give up your right to understand. He might not quite tell you what you're expecting. I mean, Habakkuk shows us that. A very unexpected answer. And so he asked again, like, that's okay too. To say, okay, I hear you, Lord. I'm not just, Habakkuk he was genuinely trying to get there, and he was respectful about it. He says, okay, I hear you, I believe you, but I still have a problem. So that's what he's doing. He's healing our wounds. He's growing us in maturity. He's building trust in our relationship with him, right? These sorts of things build trust, where maybe you have to give up your right to understand, but you get something from him that enables you to just that trust. And then you see it play out later, and then you have a watermark, a pillar of faith, something that says, yeah, I remember that time. And then I'll end with this note, which is that it's good to process all these things with God and with the community of God that we're in. Like, some of these protests are you're on your knees with God, and you're like, I don't get it. You're driving down the highway, and it's like, Lord, what's going on here? Why is this happening to me? But it's healthy and is good because, as I mentioned earlier, God speaks through other ways than just directly to you. And maybe as you're discussing it with a friend at church, with somebody if you're in a small group or some other kind of gathering, and you just bring this up, maybe God will say something through them that will be the thing that you needed. And then that's just how he set up this deal. We got to do it in community, not just by ourselves. So then he brings us to this place of maturity. So isn't this great? That we have this in the Bible, like something just so open and honest that we can go, yeah, wow, he didn't get struck dead, and God actually, by the end of the book, you see, yeah, God actually got him there, and he was insistent about it. He knew it was important for him to get there. I just think it's great. I'm really grateful that this is in God's word and that we can learn from it. So in getting and maintaining healthy emotions, let's learn that habit. And you don't have to come to God only with the big, horrible, crises, doubts. It can be smaller things. And if you don't got anything, that's fine too. You don't always have to be in doubt and in crisis. It doesn't make you like an abnormal Christian if you're okay for the moment. But let's be a people that when that happens, rather than trying to figure it out on our own and get there on our own like reasoning, when there's a gap, just say, Lord, just help me, and just lay it all out, however it comes out, and see what he'll say. Okay?